Another thing we see in Moreau is from this open start is certain surrealist themes. Certainly the idea of dreams has been very strong, but also the idea of the circus seems to be a theme that the surrealists quite like. And I think the reason is, of course, that in the circus, nothing is as it seems. Everybody is playing a role, and yet there are actors behind these roles. Everything becomes a ritual, if you will. And animals behave in ways that they don't in nature. It's a place where nature is transformed into performance. And isn't that what a painter does? It takes nature and transforms it into some sort of a performance. And so here, the circus horse, simply calls it painting, but then gives it a subtitle of circus horse. We have these forms, again, randomly placed dots against a washy background that suggests this open start. A simply drawn line, that V-shaped line that looks as if it's a sort of randomly drawn down. And then the form on the right, which looks rather quite amorphous and indistinct, but is in fact intended to be the horse, could arguably be an otter as well, in that it looks like it has fins. But I think these were all open starts in which he finds things, and he begins to then exploit it. And again, this extreme simplification derived from automatic painting. Now, if you look at enough Miro pictures, you find that the forms that they have are, in fact, usually intended to have sexual overtones. And this is so typical for the surrealists, and I'm sorry if it's offensive, but this is really what they're working on. You can see that the horse on the right is intended to be aroused, excited, with its red member down below. And the figure that's behind it, that yellowish form, looking very much like sperm, floating away. And then if that's the circus horse, standing up on an undepicted stand of some sort, then the V shape is probably intended to be the horse trainer, the circus trainer. But it doesn't look like it, of course. What is it then? Well, if it's a V-shaped form like this, then it's most likely intended to be a woman, evoking sort of the distilled, abstract form of female genitalia. And that is indeed what has got the circus horse aroused. And I'm saying this because we find these forms repeating in other works by Miro, where indeed he's a little bit more obvious about it, even though he's always working in this open start, abstract sort of way. Here, for example, again, with the open start, right? We can see where he's rubbed at the canvas, sometimes with what appears to be a rag with paint on it, other times just sort of brushing in the paint, and then finding within those forms things that he will enunciate into human forms. Notice the title on this piece, Shooting Star. Again, the paintings often suggesting a bridge between the earth and the heavens. Even the dots, the random dots in the circus horse, might suggest sort of heavenly bodies above it, right? So the horse tamer is a woman. The horse is clearly aroused, right? Freud is the major influence on surrealism, and of course for Freud everything comes back to sex as well. So if we look at the shooting star on the left, we see it's sort of highly eroticized. There's a figure, we can see this tiny little face at the top, right? So on this figure, this is meant to be the head. And you can see that it has eyes and a mouth, and it doesn't look all that dissimilar from the Catalan peasant that we saw before. And then its leg, or its neck that is, becomes this quite elongated form that leads down to the body, and there we see the repeat of the female form from the painting horse there, and arms coming off the sides. But then Miro complicates this by making one of the arms and one of the legs black like this, almost suggesting female stockings, and making the figure look equally like a figure who's upside down, feet in the air, and perhaps at the bottom there are areas that are intended to be the head. But he makes this again sort of doubling up and unclear. So again, an open start, and what it ends up with are two figures The main one we've been talking about, and the one in the lower right corner with its arms up in the air as well. These are meant to be figures who are astounded. They're in awe by watching the heavens. And again, for Miro, this is an important metaphor, it's an important motif. And we can see stars flying through the air. Some of them are drawn. Sometimes we just see with the circles the idea of the heavens moving. But directly above the figure in the lower right corner, we can see a multicolored star flying through the air. And this is, of course, giving people this extraordinary sense of awe and wonder as they look forward. Now, as Miro's career progresses into the 30s and 40s, what we find is that his focus on the heavens increases as well. And this becomes particularly apparent during the period of the Spanish Civil War, which we'll talk more about today. In 1936, led by Franco, Generalissimo Francisco Franco. In folklore, shooting stars were seen as bad omens, that the heavens were unstable. And for Miro to become interested in sort of shooting stars and looking in awe at the heavens in chaos may well have been sort of what do you want to say, a portent of the coming of war, or the idea that war on earth is rendering the heavens unstable. Or also when he talks about the fact that there's a ladder to the heavens. And certainly I think his images are very much about escape from the chaos of this world to a surreal world, through surrealism, that is, to the heavens themselves. And this is a motif that we see him work with really significantly throughout the course of his career. Our last surrealist that we'll talk about comes from Brussels. This is René Magritte. Arrived in Paris in 1927 and stayed there for 3 years, after which he returned to his home city of Brussels in Belgium. And his works present a very different kind of surrealism for us in a way. His pictures really focus on the relationship between the painted image and reality. This seems to be a theme that is, for him, the most important theme about painting. What is the role of the painting? What is the nature of the painting? And his pictures often question this relationship between the painted image and the reality that inspired it. And our picture is no different, the human condition from a few years after we returned to Brussels. So what he gives us is this image of a view out a window, in front of which we presume the painter himself has placed an easel and is painting what he sees outside the window. Although you'll notice that his view is mostly blocked by his own easel. You'd have to peek around the side of the painted image to see the landscape there. But in arranging this picture, he's lined them up almost exactly so that the painting aligns with the landscape outside of it. And that again suggests a parallel between nature itself and the painter's vision of nature. So here's a close-up. We can see that the hill line in the background, or the bushes with the tree, aligns directly with what is outside the window. And if we look even more closely, you see at the bottom of the easel. I love, by the way the painting overlaps the curtain on the left just ever so slightly to make you realize that it's there, right? And if you look at the very bottom of the easel, it's rendered so exactly, right? We see the shadow on the painting from the pegs on the easel and the shine on the different wing nuts that hold the easel together. But you'll notice that he's even lined up the grass in the background and on the painting, suggesting that there is in fact a direct parallel between what's on the canvas and what's outside. And that's his realistic painting style certainly adds to that. But what I love about this picture is that there's absolutely no guarantee that the real world behind the canvas is the same as what's on the canvas. That hill could cut a different way, right? There could be other clouds down there. Is the tree even really there? Or is it a creation of the artist's mind? Because there's nothing to suggest that it is anywhere but on the canvas in front of the window. So Magritte is really playing with the way in which images create for us a fiction, of what we're looking at, that it becomes something. I don't know. It's fooling us into believing it is what it is not. And Magritte's pictures play with this. He began his career as a sign painter, and so he was very much aware of the way in which images communicate ideas, and that really was where he learned this sort of very exact and realistic style that we see in the human condition. And one of his most famous works in L.A., out Los Angeles County Museum of Modern Art, is this picture of a pipe, and it says underneath that this is not a pipe, and then signed, and it's painted in this very exacting sign painter's commercial art style. And the title, right, The Treachery of Images, is that images lie. This is not a pipe. This is a painting of a pipe, right? And the "this" in the title refers to the painting, not to the thing in the painting. So this is really the basic question of modern art. It's a question that Magritte loves, and he treats in this surrealist fashion. What is a painting? Is a painting the subject of the painting? Is the painting the object itself? And then what is the relationship, for the surrealists in particular, what is the relationship of the painting to the real world? And we see so oftentimes that what that relationship is that it's a vehicle for transporting us away from the real world to some place entirely different. And Magritte's picture suggests that it just simply reproduces the real world, but at the same time it gives us this clue, or at least opens up the possibility that the painting doesn't have anything to do with the real world, that is creating an alternative reality. What we'll see next is that surrealism has a huge impact in Europe and in America, in not only on younger artists, but also on well-established artists. Some of the best known modern artists will actually pick up surrealism after 1924, after the movement really gets moving. And we're going to look at a few of those well-known artists who are influenced by surrealism. The first of them is Picasso. Picasso comes under the heavy influence of surrealism in the 1920s. We left him a long time ago, way back when, painting various versions of synthetic cubist collages. Remember that synthetic cubism relied on collage to bring different objects together to produce meaning, and that under the influence of other artists, Picasso had begun to make painted versions of these collages, where there no longer is a collage, but he paints it as if it were one. And this is indeed shows Picasso to be very much open to outside influences throughout his career, whether it was Braque at the beginning or Juan Gris when it comes to these painted synthetic cubist works. That certainly comes from Gris. The reintroduction of color comes from Gris. And what we find is that in 1924, he comes strongly under the sway of surrealism. So the Harlequin Musician on your left is a wonderful sort of, again, it continues this idea of painted collage, looking very much like it could have been a collage, but he's constructed it entirely out of paint. But within this, he introduces sort of biomorphic shapes. If you look at the cowl of the musicians, right there, again, his face is here, right? There's the face of the figure. And if we follow that down his neck, we can find the ruff of his costume around his shoulders, and you can see that sort of wavy line that runs around, and then he picks up those sort of teeth-like forms off the edge of it. That should remind us very much of the eyelashes that we saw in Miraut's work. The tiny little face with that hole, that hole with the cilia on the side of it, or the tiny little eyes and mouth there, remind us very much of Miraut's attempts at including the human figure, where this portrait, we still get the body down below in the Miraut, the head up above, And within that, the features themselves become sort of biomorphized, they become changed into other things. And typical for Miro, we have references to the sun and stars, female body parts, right, are all here. And again, that sort of open start with the scratching around the sides in the blue in the corners. Well, Picasso, from this, right, picks up the idea of collaging together from different forms the entire human figure, and then reducing the face to this tiny little drawn elements that are in fact very, very similar to what Miro had been doing. Miro would have been a great influence on Picasso. After all, they're both from the same region of Spain. They're both Spaniards working in France, and of course that the whole Spanish influence on surrealism, whether it's Miro or Dali, would have been quite attractive to Picasso. Here are other Spaniards making their career in France. Here's another Picasso surrealist work from the 20s up in the Krieger collection. A head of a woman, but it looks almost as if it's two faces melding together. And again, Picasso sort of moving away from representation, and not necessarily in a cubist fashion, but really picking up on some of the biomorphic forms that we saw more regularly with the surrealists. Certainly Miro, other people influenced by Miro, like Yves Tanguy, who we talked about in class. At the same time, Picasso is returning to his roots in the 1920s. So on the one hand, he's picking up this new influence of surrealism, but on the second hand, he's sort of turning back to his career. I think the fascinating thing about Picasso is that the motifs that he works with, he continues to work with. He sees them as sort of never-ending fonts of inspiration. And so in this case, the Harlequin musician goes back to this circus-performing family, and where we saw the Harlequin on the left was a portrait of Picasso himself, that he sees his performance as a painter as being akin to performers in theater pieces, performers of music. All of these things sort of fit together for Picasso. And again, for the surrealists, we saw this with Miro. The idea of appearances rather than reality is a strong and very inspirational metaphor for them. Picasso is mining a huge range of styles in the 1920s. He's just sort of forging out left and right. And almost at the same time, he's an amazing chameleon of an artist. It's hard to believe that these two works were done within a year of each other. The Lovers on the right, brightly colored, maybe with some influence from Matisse. They seem to have had a long-standing dialogue, artistic dialogue, all the way into the 20s and 30s. But the style of it, the draftsmanship, the solidity of the figures, the way in which three-dimensional form is created by the contour line around the outside of the figures, the use of shading. It's a very classical piece, very classically drawn, similar to some of the paintings he had done already in the 1900s, in the Rose period. And again, I think Picasso keeps mining his career for new inspirations. But what we see with the Lovers is a sort of a happy intimacy that we've never really seen in his work. There's no sort of psychosexual anxiety here. And a lot of people suggest that in the 20s, he is happily married. Wife Olga, at least for now, he's happily married, has a new child as well. And that he is, in fact, sort of found some peace and happiness. This, of course, won't last, but at the time, anyway, it seems to influence this lurching back and forth between different styles in the 1920s. So we see him picking up surrealism. We see him moving away from surrealism to a sort of classical mode, and he's able to sort of shift gears without half trying. One of the things that makes Picasso one of the great artists of the century is his ability to succeed in multiple idioms, in multiple art styles, without sort of blinking an eye. Here we see him working, I think, in a sort of constructivist way, a totally different kind of work in the 1920s. And again, it's not that he's moving from one thing to the next in a sort of logical progression. What he's doing is he's experimenting. looking around him, and again being this sponge to other influences. And in this case, certainly it's very much a constructivist work, where he's gone back to collage, but he's assumed more of the sort of three-dimensional assemblage idea that one finds in constructivism. And indeed, the strings of his guitar, which is drawn lightly on some of the paper, are in fact strings that have been looped around nails that are driven directly into the backing board here, right through the construction paper that he's glued down and drawn over. So with three works here, and we could look at many more for this. We've seen Picasso in the 30s jumping all over the place insofar as his artistic style is concerned. Like I said, he's a chameleon. He can do everything and do it well. So to return to his surrealist works, these continue into the 1930s. And he again has these sort of figures that have transformed from their physical appearance into something entirely different. There is here the images of a bull in the center. The primarily brown bit, you can see its horns as you look more strongly. Eyeballs sort of aligned improperly on its head above a gritting set of teeth with red between them. On the right, the matador with his cape, his amazing outfit. I think matadors were for Picasso similar to circus performers. They have a costume, they have a role to play. Appearances and true identity are often different things. They're, I guess, like superheroes that way. On the left, there is a second performer on top of a horse, and we can see that the bull has been injured and is now attacking the horse, and has in fact opened the horse's belly, has gored him. The horse's blood spilling off on the ground, and both the matador on the horse and the matador on foot are trying to distract the bull to save the horse. Of course, the horse is dead by this point, or certainly going to die. The faces have been transformed into these abstract shapes, simple triangles for the humans. Even their feet become sort of triangles on the saddle of the horse. The horse gets this incredibly long neck and this tiny little head compared to the size of its legs and bodies. And again, I think it's become surrealist in its outlook. Some nice details of the Phillips piece. There's our matador on the right, where Picasso has taken the inspiration of the real world and used it to enter into seeing something beyond that. This interplay of color and shape everywhere we look. And then here's a close-up of our second matador off to the left, and the poor horse who has just been killed ostensibly by that bull. Certainly seems as if there's no rescue here. These surrealist works in the 20s and 30s, we've already seen, sort of allow Picasso to return to his roots. The Singing Harlequin did that. Here, his Spanish heritage seems to be very important to him, in fact, increasingly important in the 1930s. He'd been doing all he can to become French. And but at the same time, we saw even in his early works that his Spanishness, his Spanish heritage was for him was a motif he kept drawing on. If we think about the Saltimbanque family, for example, his channeling of El Greco. He was always very interested in being what it meant to be Spanish in French. And here the bullfight is an intrinsically Spanish tradition. And he's now making bullfight pictures almost as a way of saying, I am a Spanish artist. And again, this interest in Spain was certainly due to the presence of Dali and Miro in Paris at the time, influence of other very successful Spanish artists working in a surrealist idiom. Picasso's interest in Spanish bullfights led to an interest in Greek mythology. He has a print he calls the Minotauromachy. What that lengthy term means is the Minotaur fight. And if you know your Greek mythology, the Minotaur, that's the figure on the right, is half man, half bull. So this is a bullfight image of sorts. And in fact, some of the themes seem to repeat from the bullfight painting in the Phillips collection to this print. We have the bull attacking a figure on horseback, another figure trying to intervene, probably hopelessly, in this attack. But he shifted the bull from being just a bull to being the Minotaur. And he's changed the gender of the figure on horseback to being this half-naked lady. Although you'll notice the leggings on the outfit that she seems to be dressed in a manner not dissimilar from the matador in the Phillips collection picture on the right. Now, the story of the Minotaur. You may or may not know the story of the Minotaur. It's ancient Greek mythology, and it comes from the fact that the daughter of the sun god, Apollo, had married the king of the island of Crete, whose name was Minos. And Minos had later defied the gods and was punished. And the punishment came in that his wife, Pasiphae, was tricked into being seduced by a bull. Now, obviously, that can't happen. But she got pregnant by a bull and gave birth to a monster who was half man and half bull, the Minotaur, which simply means the bull of Minos. Minos Taurus, right? Think Taurus in astrology, right? And so King Minos needs to imprison this monster, keep him away from civilized society. So he builds a labyrinth beneath his palace and imprisons the Minotaur there. Right? Now that's the basic myth of the Minotaur. Picasso's not interested in that hardly at all. I mean, he's not really interested in the particulars of the Minotaur's myth. He's using it for his own purposes. It kind of becomes for him a personal mythology, and one that actually has political ramifications, because what we're going to see is that this interest in Spanish heritage in the 1930s cannot be divorced from what's going on in Spain at that exact same time. In this particular case, he seems to see the Minotaur as a metaphor for Francisco Franco. Now, Franco was a right-wing party leader. He's a fascist party leader. And I use the term literally, a member of the fascist party, and was attempting to run for government in Spain. So he's a threat, Picasso thinks, in 1935 to Spain's identity. In fact, a threat to all of Europe. There are other fascists around in 1935. There's Mussolini in Italy. There's Hitler in Germany. And he sees the rise of Franco on the right in Spain as being another in this long series of far right-wing leaders that are threatening all of Europe. So the Minotaur is meant to be Franco, posing this extraordinary threat. He's holding a sword in his hand, appears to have, or maybe she is. She's got the sword. She's trying to kill him, but she can't, right? And he's coming in, trying to snuff the candle held by the little girl, looking as if he's towering over that horse and about to attack him as he runs away. The half-legged woman on the horse, and you'll notice that the horse is wounded again, just as he was in the Phillips picture. But by putting a half-naked woman on the horse rather than a matador, makes it very much another mythological image. Europa in ancient mythology was hauled away by a bull, and we see it here in a Titian picture, the Rape of Europa. And this is the basis for Picasso's image, where he has it on the back of the horse. He's sort of mixing up the mythologies here. But this idea is that what is Franco, the Minotaur, threatening? He's threatening all of Europe. And the little girl on the left is probably meant to be Spain, holding up a light and trying to stop him, probably in vain at this point, because we've seen that for Picasso, the little girl was a metaphor for Spain, going back to some of his earliest works. What's going on with the rest of the image? Well, certainly the man on the ladder, looking very much like Jesus, seems to be trying to flee by climbing out of the picture itself. The two women on the upper left have a dove with them, probably representing peace in hiding as religion flees. There's a tiny sailboat on the distant horizon behind the horse, between the horse and the Minotaur, who you can also see is erect, very small member, but at the same time erect. Is that a comment on Franco? But in any event, another image of escaping from the horrors that are being presented to us by the worsening political situation in Spain in 1935. Franco lost the election in 1936. He put himself up for public office, and he didn't win. He was voted out. So he then led a military coup to take over the government. And this led to this is what led to the Spanish Civil War in 1936. After overthrowing the Spanish government and taking the reins of government by force, Franco then received the support of Hitler. He allied with the Nazis in 1937. And at that point, Picasso immediately begins a series of prints intended to protest Franco's hostile takeover of the Spanish government. And in this series of etchings, he doesn't even bother to correct for the reversal process. So you can see up at the top it says 8th of January, 1937, backwards. And at the bottom it says the 9th of January, 1937, and also written backwards and in a rather almost juvenile hand. Then after he prints it, he signs it forwards in the lower right corner. And this is the second in a series of two prints that Picasso did called The Dream and Lie of Franco. In other words, what does he want to do, and what is wrong with that dream? So what's going on here? Upper right corner, right? We have Franco as a distorted knight on horseback, almost looking, I don't know, like a ginger root or something. And here he is again attacking a horse, right? We've seen this idea of attacking the horse as being this innocent creature that's destroyed by something horrifying, by something from Spain, whether it's the bull or the Minotaur, or now this monstrous creature that will eventually become Franco himself and become increasingly more monstrous as he progresses. On a certain level, with the sword planted in the ground and the staff with the banner on the right, he almost looks like Don Quixote, the great hero of Spanish literature, who you remember was crazy. And this is certainly underscoring the theme here, that this is a mad quest. Franco's dream of conquering is itself like Don Quixote, tilting after windmills. Upper left, we see the outcome of this, the horrors of war, a dead body mangled and bleeding next to a tree. This poor horse with its rider, both dead, curled up together as they die. It's a beautiful picture in its way of what it means to be the owner of an animal. and the sort of bond that you feel with that animal. As I mentioned, Picasso is channeling his Spanishness, his Spanish heritage, and I think he's in these images thinking about a famous series of prints by Goya. I think we looked at these before, Francisco Goya, the Disasters of War series that he did during another horrible period of Spanish history, the French occupation of Spain under the Bonapartes in 1808 to 1814, and things that he had seen, things that he had witnessed and illustrated. Picasso, working in prints, would have been aware of the history of printmaking and certainly channeling that. As we move through, again, remember they read backwards. They're going to read right to left and then top to bottom. You'll notice that as it moves forward, the creature becomes increasingly more distorted and ugly and monstrous. And it's working its way now across. And now it's even turning on the bull, turning on Spain itself, getting a set of lips and horrible teeth, and then looking like this, I don't know, this hairy intestine with a crown on top, attacking an angry bull in two different images. And now the horse also morphing into something horrifying as it's disemboweled in front of us. It was the second in a series of two prints, and the first showed, again, sort of, I think this one might be right way forward, except for the date. In other words, I think it was just left to right across, but we see what got us to that initial image of Franco killing the horse in the upper right of the second set of prints, where we see 9 more images of that monstrous knight doing various things in the countryside, leading up to the horrors that we see in part 2 of the prints. The last 4 images are done in a much more simplified style, much more quickly, and they show the horrors that Franco is bringing to the countryside. And not only does he illustrate the horrors, whether it's a mother with her child in the 2 lower right-hand corner images, or women just screaming in terror, people screaming in terror, you'll notice that it's not just the imagery that's horrifying, but it's also the way in which he illustrates, just because it's much more rough, much more ugly, to reflect the ugliness of the events. I think it's kind of an important thing to remember, that style, artistic style, can very much support the message of the piece. And for Picasso to do this in a neoclassical style, to do it in a Cubist style, would not have anywhere near the effect that he has in doing it in this much more sort of childlike, expressive style that is so immediate and so visceral that it has an extraordinary, much stronger impact than it might otherwise have. Here we see the mother with the child and the woman crawling out of a burning house, holding what appears to be a dead child to her breast. In 1937, the same year, Picasso took these images of suffering, the last 4 images in The Dream and Lie of Franco, and he translates them into this massive mural that was based on a particular event in Spain, not just the idea of Franco, but actually something horrifying that happened. A little bit later in the year, in 1937, in April, the Nazis, Franco gave the Nazis the go-ahead to use a small village in the Basque region, which is up in the Pyrenees, a village named Guernica. He allowed them to use it for bombing practice. The Basque rebels were one of the thorns in Franco's side. They were able to fight well against him. They used guerrilla warfare. They knew the mountains. They couldn't be brought under control. They were always a problem for Franco. And so he decides to let Hitler use one of the villages in the Basque country as target practice. And Nazi airplanes flew over the city. dropped incendiary bombs for more than 3 hours straight on this little village. The city burned for more than 3 days. 1,600 civilians were either killed or wounded in this atrocity. And when the news reaches Paris, which is where Picasso is, people took to the streets in protest. More than 1 million protesters turned out in horror at this atrocity in Spain that the fascists, Hitler and Franco, are propagating on their own people. Newspapers in Paris were filled with black and white pictures. And this is what inspired not only the last 4 panels in The Dream and Lie of Franco, but also the image in Guernica, based on these horrible reports of carnage in Picasso's home country. Now, this is part of what makes him address being Spanish, is the sense that one would have of patriotism to one's own country at a time when that country is undergoing horrifying challenges, the likes of which it had never seen before. Now, instead of illustrating the actual horror of Guernica, the bombs falling, the airplanes coming in, Picasso again uses surrealist metaphor. He takes themes that appeared in the second print of The Dream and Lie of Franco, translates these into various larger figures in the Guernica. Keep in mind that one is a small print, the other one is a mural. Here are some of those details, right? The metaphor of the horse that we've seen so many times, screaming in agony, a light being shined on this as someone swoops in from the window, the incandescent bulb up above, the horse's fur, looking very much almost like newsprint, like lines in a newspaper. And I think Picasso intends this because remember that his access to this information was through newspapers. The broken store down below, someone trying to fight back but unsuccessfully. We see the bull reappear. And again, with this sort of open start kind of idea, woman down below it screaming in agony. Is the bull here Franco? Is it Spain? We've seen the sort of bull be both things to Picasso. It too does not seem particularly triumphant, but also, I think, in agony. And it becomes this extraordinarily expressive image of the horror of war, inspired by a very, very real case of that. Now, the 2 prints, The Dream and Lie of Franco, both of those, and the Guernica, were all exhibited together in Paris in 1937 at the Spanish Pavilion in the 1937 Paris World's Fair. Here we see the first exhibition of Picasso's Guernica as you walked into the Spanish Pavilion. The entire pavilion was set up by the exiled government that had been thrown out by Franco, and they used the entire pavilion to show the struggle, the heroic struggle of the Spanish people against Franco. And Picasso's images were the perfect thing to choose for that. Miro had an image here as well, all of which were images that used surrealism to critique what was the horrors that were happening in Spain. It's worth mentioning the afterlife here. After the exposition, Guernica toured Europe with the idea that it would raise consciousness about the threat of fascism, that it could be used as a rallying cry for people to stand up against this sort of overthrow. It then was shipped to the United States in 1939, and it stayed there ever since. Picasso refused to let it go back to Spain until Franco was out of office. So it was housed at the Museum of Modern Art for decades, all the way until 1981. Franco, unfortunately, stayed in power all the way until 1975. Is when he finally died. Picasso never got to see Franco out of power. Picasso died 2 years earlier in 1973. Well, Picasso's not the only well-established artists who get swept up into surrealism. When the Nazis closed the Bauhaus in Germany, remember Kandinsky was teaching at the Bauhaus. Kandinsky, after the closure of the Bauhaus, fled to Paris in 1933, became a French citizen, spent the last decade of his life living in Paris. Needless to say, he arrives there at the height of surrealism. And he gets swept up into numerous works of art that are best labeled surrealist at this point in his career. Now, his foray into surrealism makes all sorts of sense. If you think about what Kandinsky has been doing all along, he's always been interested in a world that exists beyond physical reality, right? What does surrealism mean? Above reality, beyond reality. So surrealism for him seems, I would think, would have seemed just like a logical outgrowth of the sort of expressionism he had been practicing going all the way back to 30 years earlier. We saw during the Blue Rider period that it was colors and shapes that he had derived from figurative works that became a sort of symbolic language for him. Horses, monks, riders, churches on hilltops, right, that get abstracted and repeated, and then of course the colors become this symbolic language of form for Kandinsky when he was with the Blue Rider group. When he was with the Bauhaus during his constructivist period, we saw geometric form sort of take this role as his symbolic language of form. Now in his surrealist period, 10 years after the constructivist period, he's gone back away from the geometric and precisely rendered forms that we see in the work on your left, and has picked up these sort of biomorphic forms on your right. And I've got a couple details of them. They seem to float around the composition. They almost look like amoebas moving around. And everywhere we look, they seem as if they're arranged like musical notations. The single biggest influence on these forms is most definitely Miro. Again, easily the most influential surrealist artist. Had been working his open start images, his automatic painting had led him to this language of forms that have certain meanings for him, but often have these sort of biomorphic shapes that we see in this painting from MoMA on the left. And you can see how Kandinsky has picked up directly on that idea and deployed them as a series of forms across his canvas. At the same time, you'll notice that it looks very, very much like musical notation, almost as if the forms themselves should be notes on a musical score, that we read them left to right, then the next one down left to right, and so forth, that you almost think of them as musical signs, as notes. And I think Kandinsky would have thought of them the same way, because his paintings were so much linked to the idea of sound. Ever since his earliest days, there was a direct relationship between the visual image and sound because of his synesthesia. With Kandinsky, we'll come back to the work of his good friend Paul Klee. We looked at Paul Klee when he was with the Bauhaus. We looked at the work Cathedral from 1924. Remember that Klee had been friends with Kandinsky all the way back to the Blue Rider days, and they were together when they were at the Bauhaus. Now, Klee is not a member of any surrealist group, and he never goes to Paris during the 20s or 30s. But I think that many of Paul Klee's works can be best discussed in the broader spread of surrealist ideas throughout all of Europe after 1924. And in fact, really, I think these works are very surrealist in outlook. He has a consciously simplified style, something that evokes childhood innocence, childhood memories. That's a theme we've seen running through childhood memories, being a theme that we've seen running through surrealist works. We've seen an attempt to get to something primal before the sort of mature logic of the 20th century, finding something rootsy, if you will, in human existence. And I think that Paul Klee's simplified technique also, or simplified draftsmanship, I should say, uh, ends up in that exact same camp. This is also, again, juxtaposed with what we already talked about with Paul Klee's works, which is an extraordinarily sophisticated and complicated technique. Each of his paintings presents to us amazing things you can do with painting that sort of no one had ever thought of before. So in this case, he took a piece of cardboard and he put putty over the top of it. I'm not quite sure what kind of putty, but it's sort of thick, pasty putty on the top of it. And then he incised into it the different forms, and then he painted over the top of the putty, keeping within the incised lines most of the time. So you can see the sort of three-dimensional quality of the surface, with the areas where the paint even gets into those incisions, and paints them with, or draws them with, this really simplified, almost childlike kind of style. I think one of the things that separates Klee from a lot of the surrealists is he doesn't have a lot of that sexual angst that we've seen everywhere, that sort of interest in genitalia and castration anxiety and things like that came out of Dada. It's a much more simple kind of surrealism, where, again, maybe we have circus performers, right? We've seen that theme being such a poignant theme for surrealists. The arrival of the jugglers, the circus has come to town, and now, right, artifice replaces reality. Play acting replaces reality. Performance replaces day-to-day duties. This is all very strongly surrealist in outlook. We're lucky here in DC because the Phillips Collection has a spectacular collection of Paul Klee pictures. Good 10 or 12 of them there, and some of the best I've ever seen. Again, simply drawn forms, perfectly chosen colors, and a highly sophisticated technique in this image of tree nursery, one of the most beautiful things. Here he's again built up a surface, probably with gesso on top of the canvas, very, very thickly applied gesso, and then incised it again before rubbing or painting over the top of that. I think the paint application might well be partly rubbed in. There's areas where it looks as if the paint has gathered inside those incisions in a way that suggests that perhaps he's rubbing it on with his hands. The forms that he's inscribed here have less of a representational value. They look like trees for the most part, but I get a feeling that they're also kind of like hieroglyphs. And there's Paul Klee getting back to this idea of something primal, something prehistoric, a kind of writing that can't be deciphered, but means something beyond its physical form. There's surrealism for you. Means something beyond its physical form. An ancient primal language of form. And with that idea of trying to get to something primal, something original, the forest primeval, if you will, he does include two human figures. Oh, here's another shot of those, right? Some of those forms that end up looking like these hieroglyphs, right? He does include two human figures, and you can see in the lower right corner, almost imperceptible amidst all these crosses and X's and triangles and circles, we have a little man and a woman down below. I think they're meant to be a man and a woman tending the tree nursery. Again, drawn so simplistically. And again, there's that tension between the simplicity of how he draws and the sophistication of the technique. But the fact that there are two figures here in this garden, as soon as I say that, that should tip off where I'm headed with this. Could this be Adam and Eve? Not really spelling it out for us, but sort of alluding to the idea of the original man and woman placed here on the planet to tend over the Garden of Eden. Has Paul Klee in the tree nursery created a paradise before the fall, before sin, and given us, like so many other surrealist works, a place to escape from this world into something different.